All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. $10:35, not bad, folks. So my name is Ryan Hoffman, and I'm the Director of Communications at Call to Action. And on behalf of everyone at Call to Action, we're just so excited to be a part of this forum today. And my responsibility is to introduce the next panel discussion this morning. And so without any further delay, I'll go ahead and do that. Our next panel conversation this morning is Called to Serve But Nowhere to Go, Addressing Discrimination in Church Service. And our moderator for this panel is Nicole Sotelo. Nicole?
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Well, good morning to those gathered here and those joining us via live streaming or via Twitter at hashtag CatholicWomen15. I feel blessed to have been asked to speak for a few minutes to set the context of our panel and then to introduce our speakers. As Ryan said, our panel's title is Called to Serve But Nowhere to Go, Addressing Discrimination in Church Service. Since the Second Vatican Council, whose 50th anniversary we will be celebrating in this fall, there's been a very positive and transformative shift that has led to the rise of lay participation in church life. As part of this shift, local churches that were once primarily staffed by priests and religious are now primarily staffed by lay people, and 80% of those are women. Despite women's numbers, many find themselves facing discrimination when it comes to leadership and decision-making, ordination, employment, and wages. To begin today's panel, I wanted to share with you some words from a woman facing this discrimination. I received this note via a private message on Facebook. A woman had recently read a column I had written about the wage gap in the church for lay ministers. She is a Catholic lay minister on the East Coast, supporting a child in college. She agreed I could share that I could share what she wrote as long as I would not share her name. And this is what she said. Your NCR column hit home. I earn less than the average. I can't say too much online publicly, but it is really bad. I wrote back with what I hoped might be a few comforting words and asked if she might use some of the statistics I had written to negotiate perhaps higher. And she wrote back, "Thanks, Nicole. Not happening here. I just negotiated a little extra time off. For the record, and I do a lot of running of the parish day to day, I make $30,500. I then asked if there was anything I could do and offered her my prayers in solidarity. She wrote, "Thank you. Your prayers and the knowledge that we are in solidarity is a gift. I was called to this, and here I am. I spend some time crabbing to God and asking what I should do next." She then went on to write about some of her earlier work, but she says, "I then chose church, and I am way behind, so no retirement for me. My husband really does need to retire sooner. His work is physical, but we will need to live simply. That is okay, but it is justice that challenges me here." Justice indeed. I think that's why we are all gathered here this morning. For a church whose social justice teaching calls for just wages and just work, we have a far way to go in living the teaching ourselves, particularly for women. Now, many of you in this room know, often personally and sometimes painfully, the facts around lay women workers in the church. But I'd like to share with you some facts just so we're all starting today on the same page. From the very beginning of a young Catholic girl's life, She's faced with a Catholic culture that quite simply values men more than women. From the first drops of baptismal water that are poured on her head in the name of men, the Father and the Son, to the day that she dies and is anointed by a male priest, this young girl will likely experience a deep spiritual deprivation from knowing women's potential and women's goodness. If this young girl grows up and, despite everything, still feels God's call to her and is brave enough to respond to it, she may decide to enter church ministry. But here's what she's going to face. She will likely pay for a good portion of her seminary or theological education, unlike most male priests. Once she graduates, if she's lucky enough to receive a job with a contract, which is rare these days, she may find it has a morality clause which keeps her from speaking out on justice issues with which the Vatican disagrees. If she is the average lay woman minister, she will earn less taxable income than the average priest. And if she is a lay woman of color, she will earn even less than the average. She will likely not receive the same vacation time or sabbatical options as priests do. If she gives birth to a child, she will not likely receive paid parental leave. If she is a lesbian and marries her partner, she will likely lose her job. And if she loses her job due to budget cuts or parish closing, she will not be automatically reassigned, as a priest often is. And during the time in which she searches for another job, she will likely not be able to collect unemployment insurance because dioceses are not mandated to pay into the system. And in her final years, as she is asked to contribute to the special collection for retired priests, there will be no special collection taken up on her behalf for her final years. And despite all this, one thing of which she cannot be deprived is her relationship with God, and that call from God and her community to ministry. I applaud the courageous Catholic women who day after day, despite everything, remain faithful to God's call and to the needs of the people, and faithfully responds, yes. We are very lucky because we have some of these brave women with us here today on the panel, and I know many probably here listening as well. And I'm honored to introduce you to these women who represent just a small portion of the thousands of Catholics who are raising awareness and taking action for women. First, we have Sister Chris Schenk, who will be speaking on women's leadership and decision-making. Chris is a sister of St. Joseph and a fellow columnist for the National Catholic Reporter. She is well known for her work as the founding director of Future Church, which she led from 1990 to 2013. In that capacity, she administered 4 national initiatives with a focus on raising awareness and organizing Catholics to take action on women's issues in the church. She has a master's degree in theology from St. Mary's Seminary and Graduate School of Theology in Cleveland, a master's of science from Boston College, and a BSN magna cum laude from Georgetown University. Currently, Chris is researching a book about women's leadership in early Christian art and archaeology. Welcome, Chris. Next, Laura Singer will be speaking on the topic of women's ordination. Laura is a cradle Catholic who has been an active member of Call to Action and Women's Ordination Conference since 1993. She served on the initial Next Generation Advisory Council of Call to Action and the Leadership Council of the Young Feminist Network for Women's Ordination Conference. She was the board president of WAC, Women's Ordination Conference, from 2008 to 2012. And we are happy to have Laura with us here today, too. And I am also very honored to introduce Trish Sullivan-Vani with us here today to speak on Catholic women's employment and just wage. Trish is a consultant to parishes, dioceses, and ministry professional associations in the areas of spiritual formation, vision casting, and mission development. An accomplished writer, she has written multiple magazine articles and books on spirituality, sacred scripture, effective preaching, and catechesis. Trish received a Master of Divinity degree at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, and an interdisciplinary PhD in Roman Catholic ecclesiology, liturgical theology, and organizational leadership theory at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. And we are very happy to have her as well with us. And so we'll go ahead and start with Chris.
Thanks, Nicole. And I want to give my special thanks to Corpus Call to Action and CFC for convening this very timely and much needed forum on, I think, what is one of the main issues facing our church into the future. My presentation is on equal opportunity for leadership decision-making. I'm going to spend some time talking about context. Then I'll give a little bit of overview of who are some of the women in leadership now, nationally and internationally. We'll talk a bit about futuring, and then start to address what are some of the responses we can make given the situation that we're in now. So first, context. I think we have to recognize that right now the church has conflicting teachings about women. We have a teaching that women are equal, but we cannot exercise that equality because governance in the church rests only with the ordained. And by definition, women cannot be ordained, and therefore, as many have said before me, we cannot participate in the decisions that affect us directly. Bottom line is the complementarity model translates to men are equally given, male celibate men are equally given to make the rules, and women are equal opportunity to obey them, okay? So, and this applies not only to women, because it applies to all lay people are excluded from church decision-making. So, second big idea, which has been said many times, but I'll say it again, it bears repeating. The inbred monarchical clerical system, I believe, is very bad for the church. And even despite all of our organizations have been working for many years to integrate women and married men via ordaining women and married men, in fact, that is a good thing in one sense because it will broaden the perspectives of decision makers, but it will not address the fatal flaw of monarchical clericalism in which governance depends on the whim of the Pope or of the bishop, regardless of gender, regardless of married state. This is the governance model we have. So, for example, Francis's reform to decentralize via the Council of Cardinals or via his work to empower the national bishops' conferences, trying to return them to the power they had immediately after Vatican II, all of that could be reversed by the next pope. So essentially, when you look at this sort of really big switch that we're experiencing with Pope Francis, it depends on the whim of who the male is that's in charge. Okay. So we have a governance model that's badly in need of checks and balances, a system of checks and balances. And this leads to my conclusion that we need to change in canon law so that all the baptized have opportunity to participate in governance in the church that is more than advisory, but substantive. Now, I know this is pie in the sky and into the future, but I couldn't talk about this out of the context that we happen to be in, because this governance context is what is creating many, many of the problems that we face regularly. Okay, other big context statement. And even after we achieve this idyllic governance model in which all the people of God participate meaningfully in decisions that affect all the people of God, there will still be bad decisions. There will still be mistakes. There will still be sin. It's human nature. There is no perfect system, but at least we'll have a structure in which everyone is involved in making a mistake, you know? And of course, another way to talk about that is as a learning organization because we learn, but that's another talk. Okay, so now we'll look at a glance of women's leadership today, because even in the imperfect system that we have now, women are exercising significant leadership, albeit within the context of a stained glass ceiling, okay? And a recent study published by Crooks, the online Catholic news magazine, in an article in mid-May by Michael O'Loughlin, showed that of 3 high-ranking jobs open to lay people in Catholic dioceses across the United States, which would be chancellor, chief financial officer, and school superintendent, only 1/3 of all of our 197 dioceses have these positions filled by women. In fact, another 35% of 197 U.S. dioceses have no women at all in any of these influential positions. So that's of concern. Then if we look at the U.S. Catholic charitable organizations, we're doing a lot better there, I think, because as someone mentioned earlier, Sister Donna Markham has just been named the first female head of Catholic Charities USA. We have Carolyn Wu, who's the president of the Catholic Relief Services, I think exercising very prophetic leadership because the organization has just been under attack by a very vicious right-wing organization, the Lampet Society, in attacking one of their chief executives who was not Catholic, in a committed gay marriage for many years. Catholic, under Carolyn, were considering how to address this, and he spontaneously withdrew. And in the closing statement, Carolyn made a point to criticize public and decry the attack on him. And last but not least, one of my favorite women leaders in Catholic organizations is Sister Carol Keehan with the Catholic Hospital Association. And her leadership and the leadership of the Catholic Hospital Association literally changed the lives of millions of U.S. people when the organization disagreed with U.S. bishops over the Affordable Care Act and very courageously supported it. And many attribute their stands and the stands of the sisters through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious and others for helping legislators decide that, yes, it was okay to vote for the Affordable Care Act, Catholic legislators. And many believe that that is one of the tipping points that led to the attack on LCWR and U.S. women religious. And of course, you have to remember, it was Catholic nuns who started the Catholic Hospital Association in this country with a mission to serve people. Anyway, just an aside, Sister Carol was invited to speak at an April 28th conference at Rome's Pontifical University Antonium. So I guess she's not a bad girl of the Bible anymore. So you can hope for that. Let's take a look now at the International Church. At the Vatican, we have the percentage of women employed is now around 19%. In 2014, that translates to 391 women, up from 288 3 years earlier, and up from 194 in 2004. Among them, but again, it's 19%, it's 1 out of 5. Among them, 41% had university degrees and worked in professional positions such as archivists, historians, journalists, but many work in service jobs at the Vatican supermarket, post office, or museums. There are only 2 women in the Vatican that serve as undersecretaries. The 2 highest ranking are not heads of dicasteries, not secretaries, not prefects. They're like 3 levels above them, but we're glad that they're there. Flaminia Giovanelli works at the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. She's a laywoman, and Sister Nicoleta Spazzati is a member works at the Congregation for Consecrated Life. Most recently, within the last 3 weeks, and I think it was on his way home from South America, Francis said there are no plans to appoint women to head dicasteries, which are the main governing bodies of all the committees in the Vatican. Because many had said maybe, if they create a new one on lay people, we could have a lay woman. But again, the thing that we have to remember, what's governing all of this is the canons that say only ordained. So there are two obstacles here, one being that no ordained person is going to take orders from a lay person. A priest is not going to take orders from a woman, and the other one is a male oftentimes is not going to be accountable to a woman. So this is the structural thing we're dealing with. Another, though, positive sign recently is that an 8-member Vatican core group to help the Catholic Church fight against clerical sex abuse included 4 women, one of whom, Marie Collins, really led the charge in Ireland. She is a victim herself and campaigning to protect children. 3 other women were Polish Prime Minister Hanna Suchaka, Baroness Sheila Hollins, a British psychiatrist, and the French child psychiatrist Catherine Bonnet. Cardinal O'Malley remains on the commission, as well as a male canon lawyer, Professor Claudio Papali, and an Argentine moral theologian and a German psychologist. Then we can't forget the incredible women theologians and leading thinkers. I won't belabor them too long because many of you know who they are. I think of course, Beth Johnson, Lisa Saul Cahill, Ivone Gabarra, Margaret Farley, Joan Chittister. Sister Sharon Ewart was just appointed the first woman president of the Canon Law Society of America. But again, even with these wonderful women who are helping shape the future, and I want to give a shout out to Sister Kate Kunstler, who's also doing, I think, really forging new territory in canon law, particularly around successful parish appeals. But again, we have to remember that these women theologians do operate under threat of censure, as Beth and Margaret have experienced, as well as Joan Chittister. So it's a mixed bag. Sister Mary Malone has just been named the first female rector of a pontifical university, which is a big deal. The other thing is the International Theological Commission, of the 30 theologians who have been named who will serve a 5-year term, 5 women were named, which is the most we've ever had, 16%. Previously, there were 2. And again, I won't go through all of their names, but that's one step forward. The one step back here, the other person named from the U.S. is Father Thomas Weinedy, who is the former executive director of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Secretariat on Doctrine. He is the one who, I would say, maligned Sister Beth Johnson in her book, Quest for the Living God, saying that she wrote things that she never wrote, never talked to her. So you have some real concerns when someone like that is appointed to an international commission when it's really documented. You can go online and see what he said, but what was actually in the book. Anyway, don't get me going. Okay, so I think it's pretty obvious that what we have is a pretty big, bright, bold, stained glass ceiling at work. And perhaps never was that more in evidence than the situation with Leslie Ann Knight, who was an incredible Zimbabwean woman, General Secretary of Caritas Internationalis, who was dismissed in 2011 after a wonderful 4-year term, huge support by her board, but was not approved by the Vatican, that suddenly decided that they were a public juridic person, and she had to have a nihil obstat, which means nothing objection to her continuing in that role. Her boss, Cardinal Maradiaga, I'm sorry, I don't say his name very well, was given the nihil obstat. She was not. And it led to a really huge, ripple through the system. Caritas really is the umbrella organization for 165 Catholic relief organizations and development organizations all over the world. She had done a sterling job The Vatican was trying to say, oh no, she did a good job, we're just going in a different direction. But in fact, they knew nothing about this until the last minute. It was secrecy right up until the bitter end, very similarly to the LCWR and apostolic visitation of women. I found out through LifeSite News, one of the more conservative internet sites, that what they said was underneath it is that Leslie Ann had supported the Canadian Bishops Organization, the Canadian Bishops Conference basically, who did an investigation after their research and development organization, the Canadian Catholic Organization for Development and Peace, had been accused of supporting abortion and contraception, okay? And the Canadian bishops themselves did an investigation of their own body, did not find substantive issues. Leslie Ann supported the bishops' conference, and because of that, she was removed. And so it was not only an attack on Leslie, it was also an attack on the national bishops' conferences all over the world. And in some ways, it was a setup for what later happened with Francis, because this was under Pope Benedict's reign, and I think that there were reverberations throughout the Catholic network. This is my own analysis, I might be wrong, but. So anyway, this is how people are trying to survive in the current governance system, which is a dysfunctional system, all right? It has great concerns for the future, because we see a growing disaffection of women. In 1987, 52% of women and 35% of men attended Mass weekly. Now, about equal numbers, 30% women, 30% men. And a more recent study found for the first time in any of these longitudinal studies, millennial Catholic women are slightly more likely than Catholic men their age to say that they never attend Mass. This is historic. Nevertheless, we have to give a shout out to the all millennial and Gen Next women and men here who are very engaged in church renewal and reform. Nicole, Ellen Euclid, the Women Ordination Conference, Erin and Kate, the CFC women, Jen, Sarah, Future Church, certainly Jocelyn, Gina, Liz, our former program person, Dignity, Equally Blessed, Christina, Wynette. So, I mean, there's a lot of energy there. So here we are. We're in this thing. We've got the canon law. What do we do? How do we deal with the dysfunctional governance? Well, here's what some people did. Pope Benedict resigned, okay? We sort of hit the peak of dysfunctional governance. Pope Francis is working, for reform within a certain context. There are some women within this system who choose the path of prophetic disobedience and get ordained outside canon law, and that's the RC women priest folks. There are others who are working within the system that try to use canon law for their own benefit. And I think that was one of the key things that protected the women religious in the United States, because they didn't have to give all that information that the Vatican wanted. And canon law was protective, and they stood up and said no. It's also helping many appealing parishes who are being closed, vital, vibrant, solvent parishes right here in New York City, because they're on very expensive land. And many of those appeals are being led by women. We've had success. And once again, Sister Kate Kunzler is really forging new ground in canon law and rights of the laity there. While one can reasonably argue that women chancellors, CEOs, et cetera, participate in jurisdiction to a certain extent, but always in the context of the stained glass ceiling that excludes all of these wonderful lay people who are doing the mission of the church from jurisdiction. So, where do we go from here? Well, I love Francis's idea of making a mess, and so I think I want to encourage everyone to continue making the great messes that we're making in terms of calling for things that are controversial but need to be discussed in the church. I think the other thing I want to say is we need to recognize that women's leadership in church reform is in fact leadership in the church, and we can't deny that. I think of Barbara Blaine's snap. It was the mouse that roared, and it's leading to all kinds of repercussions. I have great belief that all the ways that all of our organizations are calling the system out on what needs to change is also leading to such repercussions. We have a great resource at Future Church called A Million Voices to provide resources for people who are being treated unjustly, and it sort of walks you through some things that you can do from canon law to organizing a base movement. Bottom line, it comes down to us owning our church, okay, and refusing to leave, okay? And that's how we're going to be successful, that's how we have been successful, and that's how we will continue. So I guess my message to Pope Francis, if I had to sum it up, is we're not going away. So you might as well deal with us sooner rather than later. Thank you.
And now we'll hear from Laura Singer.
Good morning. Thank you. Thanks for this invitation to speak with all of you. So the prospect of sharing my ideas with Pope Francis enticed me to join this panel. It was really energizing to think that Pope Francis might be a leader who would listen and take our comments and ideas to heart. But at the same time, when I looked at the title, Called to Serve and Know Where to Go, I really felt sad and I felt angry. Really, we're still talking about this, what women can do versus what men can do. In 2015, I really had to deal with some of those emotions. So I told myself to breathe and just think, what would Jesus do? So if I had the opportunity to speak with Pope Francis, I'd want him to know that we are committed Catholics and that we're organized. I would tell him about the women who are called to serve. And I hope maybe I can make a connection with him by sharing some about who I am and my story. So I'm a cradle Catholic from a small town, Bourbonnais, just south of Chicago. My dad had me at Mass at 7:30 a.m. every Sunday. We sat in the front row. You could not fall asleep. You could not look around. I was very devoted to the church, and I wanted to serve. In 5th grade, the priest came to our classroom, and he called all the 5th grade boys out to go be trained as altar servers. And my friend and I said, why can't we go? My 5th grade teacher, she didn't have an answer. I think she was a feminist but couldn't talk about it at the time, and she just looked at us and kind of shrugged. Then in 8th grade, they did ask me to be a lector because I speak loudly, somewhat clearly. So they did allow me to be a lector, and back in the sacristy one time, I asked the priest, I don't know how it came up, but I said, well, why can't girls be altar servers? And he looked at me and he said, no girl has ever asked me to do that. And I thought, those boys didn't ask. They just came down, they were taken out of the classroom. So it was an early example to me that even if women are called to serve, their gifts are not wanted. Later in the late 80s in high school, I asked my religion teacher why women couldn't be priests, and he said to me, the U.S. church is ready for women priests, but the other part, the Catholic Church is very big, and the international church, they're just not as advanced, they're not ready. I was sheltered in a small town, and my America-centric view, that kind of kept me quiet for a while. All right, we're ready, but we just gotta wait. So I kept being involved. I worked as an office assistant in the rectory, cleaning up the priest dishes, because they couldn't put them away or wash them themselves. I cleaned up the dishes. And then in college, I ran a service ministry out of the campus ministry office, again, answering phones for the priests and taking messages. So just before my senior year, I got to help be on the hiring committee for the campus minister. And when he was hired, a lay minister, his first thing was going to call to action. I had no idea what it was, but I felt obligated. I got this guy hired. So got onto a van one Saturday morning, had no idea where I was going, half asleep. But on the way to the hotel, I started reading this brochure, and it said something about a panel on women priests. And I was like, oh, they're going to tell me why this can't happen. But surprise, I walked into a room with standing room only, and Ruth Fitzpatrick, the co-director, or the founding director of the Women's Ordination Conference, was talking about how she'd been protesting out in front of the U.S. Catholic bishops' meetings. There were pumpkins, there were great displays. So I found my home. I was no longer alone. I found a community of people that were supporting women's roles in the church, and I became an activist. So, and I learned about this decades-old movement and this large community of support. So from my story, what's my takeaway from Pope Francis? Is that my story is now more than 40 years old, and it did take me about 20 years to find like-minded people. So maybe Pope Francis hasn't found his supportive, non-sexist community yet. So I'm here to say, here we are. We're here, there's many of us, and we want to work with you. So again, perhaps Pope Francis has been busy with Vatican protocol and such that all the petitions we've hand-delivered to his door, that he's missed these, that the banners we've hung throughout the world, the pink smoke that we burned in Rome, maybe they just haven't caught his attention. And he really doesn't know who we are as a church reform community. So I just give him a quick overview. So the organization I've had the greatest role with is the Women's Ordination Conference. And we're the largest national organization, been around since 1975. And we work to get women ordained as priests, deacons, and bishops. And we don't just want to add women and stir. We know that there are issues with the current system. So we want women to be ordained into an inclusive and accountable Roman Catholic Church. We see that the current hierarchical and patriarchal system has issues beyond just excluding women. We promote new perspectives on ordination that call for more accountability and less separation between clergy and laity. Our vision is to reclaim the Christian tradition, the early Christian tradition of a discipleship of equals. We dedicate ourselves to return the church we love back to the example of Jesus, to be a radical table community where all are invited and included. So, the Women's Ordination Conference works with many other national church reform groups like Call to Action, Future Church, Corpus, Catholics for Choice, just to name a few. And there are also international groups that are working to achieve this vision. So I hear the Pope is pretty tech savvy. So I tell the Pope to follow all of us on Facebook, Google us, and tweet to #priestlypeople come in both sexes. I think as the Pope searches his web, he would find all the work that these organizations have done to address the issue of women's ordination over the decades. He would find much data supporting women's ordination. He'd find the countless scriptural studies and dissertations. He'd find reviews of the 1976 Pontifical Biblical Commission, which found no scriptural evidence to prohibit women's ordination. He'd find the story of Ludmila Javarova, who was one of 6 women who was validly ordained in 1970 in communist Czechoslovakia to minister to Catholic women prisoners. He can sign up for one of Dr. Dorothy Irvin's tours to see firsthand the archaeological evidence of women priests in the early church. He'd find Father Roy Bourgeois, his New York Times editorial, calling for his priestly brothers to recognize the sin of sexism. And he'd also find Reverend Ida Ramming's PhD thesis outlining a path to change canon law 1024 so that all baptized persons may be ordained versus only baptized men. So I tell the Pope the good news in all of this is that the reform groups and individuals have done the hard work for him. Really, there is no need to spend any more time on needs assessments, research, surveys, or more theological research. I say the evidence is overwhelming. Ordain women now. Yes, it's direct, but life is short and we need to move this discussion along. So the Pope may ask, well, how do we do that? I'm like, glad you asked. So when this modern women's ordination movement started in the 70s, after the changes of Vatican II that we've talked about here today, many thought women's ordination was going to happen soon. It was just around the corner. So since that time, I think we've talked, many women pursued theology degrees, they attended seminary training, probably some right here in the school, and have been getting ready for ministry. The women prepared, and then they waited, and waited, and waited. But then some thought, what would Jesus do? Again, those scriptural, don't hide your light under a bushel, don't bury your talents, help those in need now. And some of them have moved forward with ordination. So one easy step would be for the Pope to accept and welcome with open arms the women's ordinations that have occurred and add a whole lot of passionate priests to his team immediately. I'd suggest that the Pope visit Spiritus Christi Church in New York, where the pastor Mary Romerman, she was ordained in 2002 as a Catholic priest through the Ecumenical Catholic Communion. If you visit this church's website, it looks a lot like most other churches' websites. You can sign up for baptismal classes, you can say you want to go to marriage prep, it lists volunteer opportunities with various ministries. Oh, yeah, there's a woman priest, and they do welcome and fully include members of the GLBTQ community. But guess what? It's been 16 years, and the world, it hasn't been a disaster. The Catholic Church throughout, the institutional church threw this community out, but it hasn't been the end of the world. This community is thriving and can really serve as a great example for all Catholic churches. Then we have the Roman Catholic women priests. They began ordaining in 2002. They began with 7 ordinations on the Danube River. So RCWP and their sister organization, ARCWP, they have women in over 30 states and 3 provinces of Canada and also some other countries. So if you're looking for a woman priest, you can go to their site and look, it's a very interactive map. You can click and find a woman priest in your area. So every one of these women, serve as an example of how the priestly model may be re-envisioned and help point the institutional church to a path to include women. But again, just adding the women to the existing system isn't going to be the answer to all the problems of the Catholic Church and its hierarchical and patriarchal system. But groups like RCWP, the Ecumenical Catholic Communion, and then we also talked a little bit about the intentional Eucharistic communities that have called forth priestly leaders from their groups. All these people have been experimenting with a number of models, and they have much to share with the Pope about what has worked and what hasn't. And they've worked for more than decades now to create inclusive Catholic communities. Let's ordain women and fully include them in the discussion for how to renew the priestly ministry. And I think, Chris, we might have shared our speech. I said, it's never going to be perfect. The system's not going to be perfect, even with women. So let's get the women deacons and priests in to bring their God-given gifts and expertise to improve the system. We're not going to renew the church just by talking about it, so let's get into it and practice it, and this will affect change. So again, hopefully the Pope takes my ideas. He's welcomed the women who've been ordained, but then he's looking for his next class of priestly candidates. He wants to have his own women's ordination. So again, we've talked about it today. He does not need to look far. There's a multitude of women ready to be ordained, who work for the institutional church. They're educated, they're prepared just like male priests, and they do the same work as priests. They just don't have the same authority or get to make the same decisions. So we've talked about it today. You just need to look around at our institutional churches and see who's doing the work. So he has a number of perfect candidates for his first ordination. So I frequently hear that the church moves slowly and that we don't want a schism in our church. But as Kate McElwee, the co-director of the Women's Ordination Conference, says, the schism has already happened. Many women, many members of the next generation, and many men have already left. The survey just released that was commissioned by Catholics for Choice reported that 75% of Catholic millennials, so those between the ages of 18 and 34, want women to serve as men in the Catholic, they want men and women to have an equal role in the Catholic Church. And then as Susan Shaw wrote in the Huffington Post last week, I would encourage the Pope to recognize that prohibiting women's ordination has the unbiblical and unchristian effect of dehumanizing, marginalizing, and excluding women from participation as full human beings of equal worth before God. Women and men are not staying to experience this harm anymore. They're leaving the church. I tried to stay positive as I was creating this presentation this week, but from my personal experience, many people have checked out of the Catholic Church in my neck of the woods. Besides turning to Catholic schools in an urban environment, my peer group is not engaged with the Catholic Church. I'm with Kate. The schism has happened. If the Pope sees the church as a key actor in bringing social justice to the poor and world peace, he needs Catholics to show up more than just for the First Communion. The Pope needs to do something radical to turn the tide and repair our church. So I say, ordain women now. I know, pie in the sky. That's what people are going to tell me. So All right, come down. So if welcoming those who are already ordained and reaching out to the women who are called to ordain, who are working for the church, is too challenging, too radical for our Pope, I have two more ideas. It pains me to say this, but Pope Francis, if you really, really want, if you must, fine. Go ahead, call together another commission to analyze this issue. Call a commission, then they'll present some recommendations that you may or may not follow. But while this commission is studying the issue again, at least in the meantime, call a truce and halt the firing of those who are following their conscience in support of women's issues, women's ordination, and LGBTQ rights and other issues of conscience while you wait your commission's results. Stop firing these dedicated employees just because they refuse to hide who they are or what they believe. Stop forcing employees to sign the morality clauses if they want to keep their jobs. Really send a signal that these morality clauses are not the way to go. Reject the silencing and inquisition-like tactics that are being used to punish these gifted workers. Again, you're firing the best teachers and our best employees, and it's causing deep harm to our church. So again, welcome these voices of dissent. Include them in your commission. So my last suggestion is that I've heard you're going to be in Philadelphia this September. So will we. So we will be there for the Women's Ordination Worldwide Conference. You're probably thinking, wow, and that's what we call ourselves, the Women's Ordination Worldwide. Our conference is from September 18th to the 20th. I have some invite cards right here, and there's discounted registration till August 1st. And then this goes to, I'm talking from my perspective as an American Catholic, but this is going to be speakers from Spain, Great Britain, South Africa, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Australia. We're also including presentations from Mormon feminist Katie Kelly and Azra Namani, who's speaking about her journey as a Muslim, to include women equally. So Pope Francis, we'd love for you to be there, and if your people call my people, we can get you a deal. We can get you a deal. Yes. So I'd call on Pope Francis to be brave, welcome the women priests in his midst, and ordain women now. In doing so, it will shore up the Catholic Church for a bright future of bringing forth social justice and living out Jesus' gospel of love. But again, Pope Francis, I ask you to do something quickly, because I'm pretty sure I hear the Episcopals knocking at my door. So, thank you.
And next we'll hear from Trish Sullivan-Vani.
Good morning, everyone. It is a delight to be among this illustrious group of sisters to present our ideas and with the wonderful men and women of the panels throughout the day. I'm going to speak to you today about data that was pulled together while I was the executive director of the Emerging Models of Pastoral Leadership Project. It was compiled by Kara, and it is still available for crunching and noodling down there, and I'm going to pull some of the basic thoughts that they came out with around the issue of lay ecclesial ministry and its status in the church. Back in April, Pope Francis, in a speech on the importance of marriage in society, commented, "Why should it be taken for granted that women must earn less than men? The disparity is pure scandal." Of course, few of us gathered here would disagree with the Holy Father, but we might also concede a point that New York Times columnist Frank Bruni made when he said that this comment was, quote, "an epic mismatch of messenger and message." Bruni asserted that neither Pope Francis, and this is a quote, nor any other top official in the bastion of male entitlement known as the Vatican can credibly assert concern about parity between the sexes. Their own kitchen is much too messy for them to call out the ketchup smudges in anybody else's. Never afraid to assess Catholic trends, or for that matter, the pattern of ketchup smudges, Mark Gray of Kara the nonprofit research center that conducts social scientific studies about the Catholic Church, decided to cover the pay gap in his 1964 blog. And what he found was noteworthy. But before we look at the question of pay equity, I think it's useful to take a look at the demographics of those who are employed by the parish church so we understand the group that we're considering. In 2013, there were more than 17,900 parishes in the United States, according to the USCCB. The total number of paid staff in those parishes is approximately 70,000 people, not including the priests and the deacons. Of all the paid lay staff, I'm going to focus this talk on the group we give the title lay ecclesial minister. These are people who are, for example, pastoral coordinator or moderator of a parish, pastoral associate, director of religious education, youth minister, campus minister, hospital chaplain, etc. They are overwhelmingly college educated, and most hold graduate level degrees. What our research revealed is that lay parish staff, on average, is aged 58. More than 80% of those people are women. It's also noteworthy that our data revealed that only about 1 in 20 lay ecclesial ministers are of the millennial generation, in other words, born in 1982 or later. If we look at the data, and unfortunately I had this all on charts and a PowerPoint that has disappeared into technology difficulty, so if you're interested in seeing these charts, we'll be sure to have them available to you on the website. But if you were to look at all the data about how the race and ethnicity information shapes up around parish lay ecclesial ministers, we would discover that 88% of this group, that is 80% female, is white. 9% are Hispanic, 2% are Black, 5% are Asian, and 5% self-identify as other. So when we're talking about lay ecclesial ministers, we are discussing, for the most part, middle-aged and older white women. We should note, though, that this demographic is not tracking with the demographics of the North American church as a whole, or where that church is trending. And it's very important to highlight this because we are at a moment, hopefully, where this entire nation is taking the next steps of looking at the embedded racism in the United States. And we need to acknowledge that the U.S. church, despite a hundreds-of-year-old African American church and a hundreds-of-year-old Latino church, has not equitably enfranchised either African American leadership or Latino leadership in its lay ecclesial ministry, nor in the diaconate, nor in the priesthood. So that's the snapshot of who we're talking about. And that data was captured, as I mentioned, by Mark and his CARA colleagues while I was the project director. This data was culled from 3 national surveys related to parish life and leadership, and one of them was shaped by the National Association of Church Personnel Administrators, otherwise called by its acronym NACPA. So what did we do? We surveyed 5,701 people who work in 433 randomly selected parishes, and that is a statistically valid representation of the national church. Now, keeping in mind that parishes also rely enormously on a big cohort of unpaid persons. So we aren't talking about those, we're talking about salaried people. What did the salary data reveal? The emerging models NACPA data revealed that the average salary for lay ecclesial ministers, the people I just described, is $32,000 a year. Let's look at that number in light of the wage gap. Using the emerging models data, Mark discovered that women lay ministers actually make 11 cents per dollar less than their male counterparts. He then compared the 11-cent less gap to the gap at the White House among employees. And in fact, noted that the Catholic Church is doing better than the White House. The White House has a 12% gap, a 12-cent gap. And of course, nation as a whole, we have about a 23-cent gap. And Mark commented, although a gap still exists, the situation in the church is apparently better than the White House or the country as a whole. And while Mark is technically correct, it is 1 cent better, he did not focus on the point that deserves highlighting. The average salary for women in the White House is $78,400. That would be $46,400 more than the $32,000 average salary for a woman who's serving on a parish staff. So despite my friendship with and my great appreciation of Mark, I will say that I don't agree. I would say that the situation in the church is not better than the White House or the nation as a whole. Let's take a look at the, may I have your water? Oh, please. Let's take a look at the average salary of lay ecclesia ministers compared to other jobs. If you were a medical assistant, you would make a comparable wage, $30,550. If you were the assistant manager at McDonald's, you would make a comparable wage, $33,000. There, the gap starts to jump. If you were a public school teacher, your average wage would be $56,000. An associate professor of theology, something of interest to me, as a recently minted PhD, $59,000. If you were a Target store manager, a place I frequent often as a mother of three, before your bonus, you would make $65,000. And if you were a registered nurse, $66,000. And of course, you could always choose to be an Uber driver. And that would be $74,000 if you were in San Francisco. So let's think about the factors that have contributed to this chronically low compensation. Salaried lay ecclesial ministry, while not new in our lives, is in fact new in the life of the church. The term did not even exist 50 years ago. And the Second Vatican Council, while calling for the increased involvement of the laity in the church, did not envision that as involvement in salaried leadership, but rather the council saw it as the engagement of lay Catholics in the world in the matter of leaven, expressing their faith through their discipleship wherever they were found. And the model was, and it is referenced in the documents, Catholic action. However, after the council, we saw this incredible surge of interest among lay people to participate in the organizational life of the church. At the same time that this then unforeseen form of ministry was happening, we saw a decrease in vocations to religious and priestly life. Chuck Zeck, and of course the data here the chart I would have liked to have shown you is a number of 180,000 approximately religious sisters at the close of the council to the number of 50,000 religious sisters, including the retirees, in 2014. Chuck Zeck of Villanova, who researches trends in parish administration, described the situation this way. The non-ordained vowed religious have always been an important while inexpensive pool of labor for parishes. I would add they have also been an exploited pool of labor for parishes. Back to Chuck. They've traditionally been a critical source for parochial school teachers and other vital parish ministries. Those positions still must be filled. More and more frequently, they are now filled by professionally trained lay people who deserve compensation from the parish in accord with their professional credentials. One can't help but wonder at how the gender discrimination of centuries of undercompensated women religious has simply taken a new form in the compensation of the laity in parishes. Unlike teachers and nurses, two occupations that in prior generations were overwhelmingly female, that now have livable wages, church ministry compensation remains low and has not kept pace. Now, I'd like to do a little aside about the priests. In his blog, Mark also notes that priests, in fact, receive the lowest wages in the parish at an average of $12.60 per hour, which rounds out to $15,000 to $18,000 per year. However, the perks of the priesthood, allowances for housing, food, car, various types of insurance, cable television, telephone and cell phone, landscaping and other property maintenance, housekeeping, snow removal, etc., make up more than we would need to make up to accommodate that pay gap. We then can add to that unmonitored cash stipend income, Christmas gifts. I don't know about you, I never heard of this before, the clergy handshake, where someone's slapping a 20 to you, I guess. Guaranteed retirement housing, if we ever let them retire, but that is an entirely different talk about an injustice that our brothers are facing. Zero academic debt, as Nicole mentioned, continuing education allowances, and tax benefits from the US government. It is clear that our priests are, for the most part, doing just fine financially. Duke University research pointed out that while Catholic pastor income is among the lowest among Christian clergy, the added provisions that I just listed make, and this is a quote, the Roman Catholic model the best model for financial quality of life among clergy as a whole. Now back to ecclesial ministers. How do wages shape up when we look at compensation by role? Kara has crunched that data, and it's a useful chart. It moves from 55,000 at the level of lay administrators. Male lay administrators make 55,000. Lay women make 40,000. That is the greatest per dollar pay gap. Interestingly enough, in a role that is more disposed to be a male role. Pastoral ministers, the salary gap, 39,000 versus 35. Young adult and youth ministers, 36 and 31, and so forth. With only one exception, the gap for lay ministers, the discrepancy favors men every time. Now, given that our Catholic social teaching calls for just wages, it's also important to consider this ministry compensation model in light of the current poverty threshold. Circling back and keeping in mind that lay ministers on average earn $32,000, consider that right now a 4-person family, 2 adults and 2 children, is at the poverty level with annual cash income below $23,000. MIT's work on a living wage, 2 adults and 2 children, and I'm going to quote the state of Ohio, out of the heartland, home of Chris Shank, indicates that the required annual income for a family of 4, a living wage, is $56,193. That is a $24,000 gap. As early as 1940, the US bishops prioritized the importance of a living wage for workers. In their statement on the church and social order, they wrote, "The first claim of labor, which takes priority over any claim of the owners to profits, respects the right to a living wage. By the term living wage, we understand a wage sufficient not merely for the decent support of the working man himself, but also of his family. a wage so low that it must be supplemented, and this is a statement of its time, of course, in terms of the gender language, a wage so low that it must be supplemented by the wage of wife and mother or by the children of the family before it can provide adequate food, clothing, and shelter, together with essential spiritual and cultural needs, cannot be regarded as a living wage. That is 75 years old. I'm going to move past my diocese data because Chris shared it with us. Many people are asking, why don't we see a younger, more diverse cohort pulling up behind this aging white female lay ministry group? Well, there are significant differences between today's young adults and those of prior generations, especially in terms of workplace style, monetary expectations, and technology use. I think Kathleen Cummings, director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame, got it spot on when she said, quote, "They've grown up in a world where all doors have been open to them. And it just strikes a disconnect when they see the church with no female leadership. At least they're not the ones at the altar." I will add that right now, 90.5% of lay ecclesial ministers report directly to a priest pastor. And only 71% of those people have a job description.
Wow.
So, while the lack of access to avenues that follow ordination, as we've heard earlier, is a justice issue, I would like to add that the lack of representation of women in leadership is not limited to the Catholic parish or the diocese. The majority of the heads of houses in Catholic publishing are male. The majority of executive directors of Catholic ministry professional organizations are male. The majority of Catholic theologate faculty members are male. The majority of published Catholic liturgical composers are male. The majority of Catholic theologians are male, although women are slowly closing that gap. And the majority of consultants, of myself being one, assisting in parish mission and vision casting is overwhelmingly male. Often people point to the bad giving among Catholics as justification for unjust personnel situations. Again, according to Villanova's Chuck Zeck, since the pattern was first discovered in the 1970s, Catholic households have contributed to their church at about half the rate of their Protestant friends. During the last 4 decades, the typical household has reliably contributed 1.1 to 1.2% of its income to the parish. During the same time, the typical Protestant household has reliably contributed 2.2 to 2.5% of its income to its congregation. And median Catholic household income is exactly the same as median Protestant household income. Chuck observes, if U.S. Catholic households simply gave at the same rate as their Protestant friends, U.S. Catholic parishes would realize another $8 billion in revenue each year. In other words, Catholic collection revenue would double. Getting to that level, I would say, would require a momentous rebuilding of trust that could only come about through complete financial transparency at the parish and diocesan level. Finally, and by no means the least, I want to comment on how women in parishes and dioceses are almost entirely in roles that are subject to the vicissitudes of priestly leadership, as we've heard. They are at will, church employees are at will. They are vulnerable to the likes and dislikes of new pastors who consider regime change part of their purview. In addition to transition vulnerabilities, lay workers can be fired, as mentioned, due to perceived personal lapses tied to morality clauses, such as living with or marrying someone of the same gender, accessing birth control or in vitro fertilization, having a child out of wedlock, and more. In addition to not having job security, there's frequently a lack of any form of due process to address accusations that the individual has acted in a way that is in conflict with, quote, the doctrine, the teachings, the laws, and the norms of the Catholic Church. Not long after he was elevated to his office, Pope Francis called upon us to develop a new theology of women. I would argue that the issue is not the articulation of a theology of women, but a new articulation of an authority, a theology of authority, a theology of responsibility, a theology of mature obedience, healthy dissent, a theology tied to identity and vocation, all of which would serve us far better. So those questions are the ones that I would love to see the Holy Father address as we seek to operationalize what I would hope would be a dialogical church empowered by a ministry of equals that includes the meaningful organizational leadership of women. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for giving us so much to think about. I would love to just ask, I know there's been so much done by the different church reform groups, people gathered here today. What would you suggest if there's a Catholic listening in via live streaming, for example, who would love to do something practical on the local level in their parish? What would be one thing that you would say a Catholic could do to support women in the church?
You're singing our song. Future Church has a huge array of easily downloaded resources at futurechurch.org. We just had over 200 celebrations of Mary of Magdala worldwide. Part of the Future Church mission is always about providing resources for Catholics who are really called and passionate about positive reform in the church, working in their parishes but don't know what to do. We have bunches of stuff from our Women in Church leadership effort. We have a whole effort going to the Synod on the Family. We have open letters. We have Celebrating Women Witness, which are prayer resources, educating about women in church history. So go to the website, see what's there, and go for it.
Great. I would second using the Future Church materials and going to prayer services like the Mary Magdalene. I think in the church setting it is hard, but ask questions at the committee meetings, at the ministry meetings. Ask questions. Why aren't women included? One way, the Women's Ordination Conference has dollar bills that you can put into the collection basket. I put some out on the table, so you could take some of those with you. So if you want to kind of make a statement at church, you can put those into the basket saying you're redirecting your donation to a organization like Walk or another organization that supports equal roles for women and men. And then I would say, come to our conferences, come to Call to Action, look up, come to the conferences for the Women's Ordination Conference, and you'll meet other like-minded people and find additional resources.
I would say be willing to extend yourself as a supporter and mentor. When I went to Dow Jones right after college, I was, in a few years, the youngest woman manager, executive person in the company. And at that time, a wonderful woman who was a top executive at Dow Jones at the time sought me out and expressed interest in me and asked me questions and sort of boosted me because, while the church is behind, this was the 80s and it wasn't exactly a picnic for women in corporate life then either. I'm sitting on a dais with Chris Schenck, who from the time I first poked my then more authentically red head up and started saying things, was cheering me on and asking questions and supporting me. And then I, in turn, found Nicole on a lunch line at Call to Action many years ago. And that is so sustaining. That is so sustaining. And I also think it's one of the gifts that women religious give us, a culture of women loving, appreciating, and supporting other women.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I know there are probably many questions and perhaps comments from those gathered here. So I'd like to go ahead and open up our time for some dialogue. I see a question over here in the back. Yep.
Hi, I'm Dolly Parmelo, and in 1976, I was one of the founders of the Women's Ordination Conference. So I have a very long history of working with women's ordination issues. However, somebody mentioned that we thought ordination would come soon. In those days, we were predicting 10 years. Poor prophets are we. The other thing is that people, or the bishops and the hierarchy, complained that women were not sufficiently strong or emotionally able to become priests. The people were not ready. They had all kinds of objections. Another one was, women are in it for the power. They want the power of the priesthood. And most of these have been debunked, actually. I think all of them. But recently I've been thinking that maybe we could shift some of our focus of strategy to working to separate jurisdiction from ministry in the institutional church. And if women are in it only for the power, then they will go for the ordination. If women are in it for the ministry, they will go for the ordination. If they're in it for the power, then they'll go for the jurisdiction. But my final conclusion on this is, I would like to see how many men would continue to seek ordination if jurisdiction and ministry were separated.
Yeah, that's a good question. Very interesting.
Other questions? We have one here in the front. Oh, Deborah? Oh, okay.
Trish, can you hear me? Okay. My question is for you. Thank you for critiquing Mark Gray's blog. I was irritated when I read it because I thought it was an argument from weakness, like, okay, we're 1% better than, and I'm really glad you brought those numbers up. One of the things I wonder about, especially in terms of your work, is what mechanisms have been tried, what mechanisms are possible for organizing lay ecclesial ministers in a way that brings strength in numbers against an organization that has, really sort of abused their goodwill.
Well, I think, two mechanisms have come through the activity of the ecclesial professional organizations and the USCCB, and I really think that Co-workers in the Vineyards of the Lord was an important and valuable document. I'm sure it's still being taught in seminaries. The professional standards for ministry, which were implemented in partnership by a number of ministerial organizations, were wonderful. I have to say, though, I really do think that in the last 10 years, I left corporate life to enter into ministerial leadership in 1997, and I have to say in the last 10 years, I really have felt almost a hostility growing toward lay ecclesial ministry, and a creeping fear of stability and job security among folks in ministry, with bishops who have been, now I'm talking as someone from the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, and I will not unpack that, but, in an environment where, ministerial offices in many dioceses have been shut down, where people have been treated very punitively by a new cohort of priests who do not see collaborative ministry as a value in the manner that many of the men who were energized by the Second Vatican Council, and even the guys who were the JP2 guys. There are a lot of, my work takes me out in the presence of hundreds of priests through my faculty association with the National Association for the Continuing Education of Roman Catholic Clergy. I want to say I have met countless wonderful priests, tremendous priests. they are under siege for a whole other set of reasons. But there is a group that has become much more interested in what I would assert is a model of church that never really existed. Something that's sort of grounded in a fantastic view of the 40s or something like that. My parents grew up in that church. They've disabused me that it was quite as perfect as it's made out to be.
Yes, I see a few hands over on the left. I might also just add, personally, I know there's been a lot of work also done for church workers by some of the reform organizations. Call to Action, Dignity, and others have really been working to kind of not officially unionize, but bring together church workers to offer emotional, spiritual support, but also, when appropriate, team them up with both canon lawyers and secular lawyers, where there could be a little bit of justice made. So there are some strides happening in the church reform movement. I see hands over here, but the microphone's here, so we'll go with this one first and then move over to the left.
Just very briefly, one comment to add to Trish Vanny's argument here is that when you take into account the salaries of Roman Catholic priests in the United States, they're not supporting families that we know of. The other, but the other question I want to ask, and it's really quite just informational, who owns the Catholic Church in the United States? I mean physically and financially. Who owns the property? Is it, do individual religious orders own it? Are the hospitals in the hands of orders or individuals or corporations? I know the universities are usually in the hands of lay trustees, but who owns the church? I think that would help a lot.
I think it varies, doesn't it? Like in Chicago,
Yeah.
the Archbishop owns all the properties, the cemeteries, the churches, or whatever. Maybe not the house.
Sure.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about religious orders, and religious communities are independently, they're civilly incorporated as well as being part of a canonical thing, and religious orders do own their own property, and many times it's property on which schools are built. In many dioceses, though, depending on whether it's corporate sole or not, but effectively, the bishop owns all the parishes, all the land, and that is one of the driving forces, I think, in New York City, why Cardinal Dolan just closed like over 50 parishes, and anyway, that's a whole other issue, but many of them are on Manhattan prime land. So, but I think that is a great question that deserves more in-depth study than what we all know anecdotally.
And I think it's an important place to point, because when we look at this discrepancy between Protestant and Catholic giving, I don't know it's that we have some poorly formed sense of the importance of supporting our church. I think it has a lot to do with an investment in ownership, guidance, governance that has people rein in their giving, because once that money is dispersed, they really have a say about that, completely dependent on the degree to which the canonical pastor is willing to share the authority and control around decision-making in the parish. And it would be equally said of the diocese. I have to say that I was very impressed by Archbishop Harry Flynn when he turned over the University of St. Thomas to its trustees and allowed it to, and took the role of the Archbishop off the governing board. And this historically Catholic university, given the climate we were about to enter and the way St. Thomas has continued to develop as such a wonderful Catholic institute of higher education, I think locally we owe a debt to Archbishop Flynn.
I think we have time for one more question.
I think this has been alluded to by what you said, Nicole and Trish, that really our goal and the image that we want to project is partnership and not complementarity, where we're the strawberries on the cake, but when men and women are sitting together at that panel and we're all saying the same thing and supporting each other. And to that, I don't know if you have any other suggestions, but I think that's the goal that I hear each of you saying.
one of my concerns around the question of a living wage, as you know, the mother of three has all children who have ambitions of being fully college educated, is it's so difficult for younger folks coming in. I don't think it's an accident we have 58-year-old average age. And I would like Mark to crunch the data on whether or not that was second income. Like, I don't know that we really adequately looked at that. But I taught at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley while I was doing my PhD, and I have never met a more vibrant and remarkable group of lay ecclesial ministry students. But if my scan of Facebook pages is any judge, I think fully half of them are not in active ministry. And this is only about 5 years after I knew them. It's just too hard to make it on the salaries we're paying and given the insecurity.
And with that, I think we'll draw our panel to a close. But I think if we might end on a note of hope, just hearing from the people on the panel and then knowing those around the room, there's so much being done in the church for church worker justice, and hopefully we can continue the conversation over lunch and for those at home in our home communities. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Speaking of lunch, lunch is served right across the hall here where we had breakfast. So please enjoy that. Just a reminder that we will start the third panel at 1 o'clock back in this space.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, come and chat with me. Thanks.
Thank you for the panels. It's a good balance.